Welcome to a special presentation by the Hastings County Historical Society. We are coming to you today from the Manly MacDonald Room in the John M. Parrott Art Gallery, which is located on the third floor of the Belleville Public Library building. Actually, there are 3 rooms of paintings here in this gallery, and it's well worth a visit. Now today, we're bringing you the second chapter, if you will, in our public presentations. We've had to cancel the presentations we were making at Maranatha, which a lot of people enjoyed, and we certainly enjoyed bringing them to you. But this time we must be in virtual form because of the COVID-19. Now today we have a very special film. It's called Moving Mountains, the Blairton Iron story. Now Blairton is a village very close to Marmora. But this documentary, which was prepared by local videographer Sean Scally, and it goes into the story of the Blairton Iron Mines, the ironworks in Marmora, the bridge across the Rice Lake, and even some mysterious stories about what's under the narrows of the Trent River. So I hope you'll just sit back, enjoy, relax, and follow this story called Moving Mountains.
There is often a desire to follow some of the more outrageous leads in any investigation, even though they might in the first place appear to be somewhat in variance to the original intent of the inquiry. At times, the lead takes one along a path that at first appears to be quite separate, but is indeed a part of the story that is to be followed. Such a case was the case of the lost ore cars of the Blairton Iron Mine at Trent River.
This story is important because I am that fifth generation person from Belmont Township. The Ellis family goes back to the 1860s, 1850s, and I feel that our history is just as good as anyone else's history. And this part of Canada has stories that are mind-boggling. And I've loved listening to my father and his friends tell stories about the area. And I think it's important that Blairton and this land that was so integral to the opening up of this region be preserved and told, the story told.
This is the story about the Blairton mine and the wooden ore cars built by James Crossan for the Cobourg, Peterborough, and Marmora Railway and Mining Company of the 1860s. The cars were designed to carry iron ore from Blairton Mine to Cobourg. Remnants of these early rail cars have miraculously survived at Trent River Narrows, after a tragic accident took the life of a man and left 6 of the cars submerged and preserved in the Trent River for the last 100 years.
I love puzzles, and this was a puzzle that the pieces needed to be fitted together. So personally, I was attracted by the fact that nobody had fitted these pieces together. We were the first to do it. So we found the newspaper article from 1881 in the Peterborough paper, which is just a little an inch long article saying that there was an accident at the loading area in which one of the workers lost their lives.
There was an anonymous newspaper account dated August 9, 1881, which read as follows. The third and last victim at the Blairton mine was Samuel Bray, an old pensioner of the British Army, who took pride in showing many scars received in fierce engagements in 6 years. His last being in the taking of Alma Heights in the Crimean War. Bray was drowned at the dumping ground at Trent Bridge.
And it's a bit sketchy in terms of describing exactly what happened. Later on, there was another, the mine manager, a fellow by the name of John Lasky Onger, who was managing the mine at that time and ended up living out his life in Blairton. He wrote letters to the Marmora Herald, many letters, about many things. But one of the ones, he described the accident that day.
And these 2 islands out here are actually man-made curbed islands where they used to dump the iron ore off of the cars into barges waiting to haul it upstream and then down to Cobourg for the ironworks there.
The cars had to be backed up, and they had to be backed up an incline in order to get to a high enough level so that the ore could be dumped. So that track then, given that the spacing, once it had to have a significant rise to it, almost like a hump, to get up to the cribs. So when they were unloading the cars, the driver had to sort of get these cars up this hump and then back them onto the cribs. And this was a bit of an art form because a steam locomotive, okay, you apply a certain amount of steam, but once you've got that steam up, you've got to be able to control that. You don't want to keep that steam on too long because you've put extra power on to get the cars up to this higher level. But then you've got to cut it off quite quickly, otherwise the whole train is going to go off, right? And I guess the engineers got quite good at this over time. But on this particular day, the way John Lasky Onger describes it, he said what was happening was there was a young fellow. Well, the engineer was there, but he was off having a cigarette or something. And a young fellow was left to do this job of backing up the train onto the cribs so that the cars could be unloaded. And the young fellow, maybe he hadn't done it that many times. He was having trouble. He was struggling getting the steam right, just enough to get it up there, and he wasn't able to do it. So the way John Lasky describes it, the engineer who's watching this gets a little irritated that this young fellow's not able to do this. So he goes, oh, you know, move over, son, I'll show you. So he gets back in the steam engine and gets a little carried away now in showing this young fellow how to do it. And he puts on steam, but he puts on too much steam, the way John Lasky Ollinger explains it. So they get the cars up there, but now he can't stop the engine in time. So 6 cars go off the end, simply because this engineer's gotten carried away. So that is how the accident occurs. It's an unusual event. There's a young fellow and then the engineer and somebody gets carried away. And so the cars end up in the Trent River.
Thereafter, the 6 empty ore cars lay in and on the bottom of the river at Trent Bridge until 1967. In summer, some scuba divers exploring the river bottom near the remnants of the old railway pier came upon some wheeled objects in the mud.
My brother-in-law lived near the property in Trent River, and he heard the story about it years ago, so we went sport diving and seen them. Didn't know what they were. They were all, you would think that you look at a railway car on a railway tracks and it's sitting there, but you've never seen them go off the end of a dock. So they were all on top of each other, and it was hard to make out.
As no one in the town seemed to know anything about them, and after a lapse of more than a decade, the presence of the railway-type vehicles off the river pier at Trent Bridge came to the attention of Mr. Arthur D. Dunn of Ottawa early in 1979. As an industrial archaeologist, Mr. Dunn had great interest in the iron ore workings in the Marmora region, and he was curious as to the precise nature of these submerged artifacts.
There was a retired federal civil servant, Arthur Dunn, who was a mining engineer, and he had the vision of creating a Tier 1 federally sponsored museum in Marmora to celebrate mining in Eastern Ontario. And so he started traveling around the area trying to come up with things that could possibly be in that museum. And at one point, a diver came to him, Brian McCrodin, and said, well, you know about the ore cars that are in the Trent River. And Arthur said, no, I don't know anything about that. And he said, well, yeah, there's 6 cars that went off the loading trestle, about 100 years ago, and they're still down there because I've dived the area, and he's a commercial diver. So he said, they're still there.
But I mentioned Arthur, and then we went and during the winter, because the water was very murky at that time, we didn't have any zebra mussels, that we dove through the ice in the wintertime to get photos of it and measured them all up.
So that would be a good thing. So immediately Arthur said, well, that would be a great thing to have in this museum.
It was only with the handling of molten iron that industry as we know it today became possible. For many centuries, man had forged items of iron, first from meteoric materials, and then, as he learned to produce, crude iron blooms from the ores that he had by the time identified. Man had learned to cast iron into complex forms, from which ultimately they were able to produce the machines that made the Industrial Revolution possible. It is fairly evident that the provision of local supplies of iron commodities was the primary reason for the consideration by the Lieutenant Governor, Sir Peregrine Maitland, in establishing ironworks in Upper Canada when he was appointed. Enter Charles Hayes of Dublin. He was a businessman and became quite wealthy as a linen merchant, and in 1819, Hayes visited Upper Canada to discuss the whole project with Sir Peregrine Maitland himself, and it is possible that at this time he first visited the site of the town that was later to be called Marmora.
It's remarkable that we know as little as we do about Charles Hayes, perhaps because it's such a common name, but he seems to have been related to a family that came from Ireland and were linen merchants. He also is referred to as having worked at the King's dockyards in England before he came over here. Obviously was very well heeled, at least when he arrived, not when he left, but he was well heeled when he arrived. And he was obviously an adventurer. Over the next 4 or 5 years, developed a community which still exists and an industry which employed 150, 200 men, plus all the supply chain that's related to any industry like that, supporting farms and the charcoal reducers, the loaders for the top of the furnace. It was 2 furnaces were 35 feet tall. They were loaded from a cliff at the top by loaders who poured in iron ore, charcoal, and limestone as a flux. At the base of this chimney, the whole sandwich of material would slowly burn down towards the base, where the blast, it's called a blast because there is a blast, and there were water wheels driving enormous bellows, 25 foot long each, which just blast the base to keep that fire going, because you had to get something approaching 3,000 degrees to melt the iron ore. So this was, there was quite a work crew involved. And when the blast furnace was going, it would be called a campaign. That campaign would go on for 6 or 9 months, during which they would produce up to a ton of product a day out of each furnace. So this was a hive of activity, and one in the middle of nowhere, but it was a hive of activity.
The main buildings of the Marmora Ironworks appear to have been completed quite rapidly, with the services of a number of good competent workers, as well as the necessary materials to construct the specialized buildings and equipment that we know were in production by the middle of 1822. At the time, some 100 tons of cast iron products had been produced at the new ironworks.
Problem for Hayes became that within 3 or 4 years, some of his government contracts, a lot of what he was doing was making ballast to go in the ships of the British Navy. And that's a very heavy product. It's hard to take out. But not only that, the Upper Canada government wasn't sending the contracts they were supposed to. They had promised when he came to buy so much ballast, and they weren't quite getting around to passing it in the legislature and forwarding it to him. So after 4 or 5 years, he was getting to the stage where he must have reflected that my fortune is going into those furnaces just as if I shoveled it down the chimney top. It's disappearing. I'm losing money.
By this time, Hayes had also found that the originally indicated source of ore had not proven to be of significant size. Hayes set off in search of a better source of supply of ore, which he found at a site known as Blairton.
What had attracted people to the Marmora area? One of the major things was described as an inexhaustible mountain of iron ore, which would be able to sustain the empire indefinitely. That was a bit of an exaggeration. Nevertheless, 7 miles from Marmora, at an area now designated as Blairton, was a mountain of very high quality iron ore, which was what Hayes wanted to exploit and what subsequent owners of the mine did exploit.
For the next 50 years or so, Marmora Ironworks continued to operate in a sporadic way. Then, with the rising demand for timber in the United States, the site was cleared and replaced by sawmilling operations, the mine at Blairton supplying ore to furnaces in the United States.
I think he was able to see what was wrong, but he just couldn't correct it. Partly because of the financial times, partly because the government was sort of playing with him, encouraging him, being nice to him, but not really wanting to fund him too much. So I guess we're right to feel proud of the whole place and what happened there and to try to preserve it.
Blairton was described as being 40 miles east of Peterborough, between Havelock and Marmora, and a newspaper article written in 1867 titled "Blairton Declared." As one emerges from the swamp and enters the village, it is apparent the houses are quite new, constructed of unpainted wood but very comfortable. The mining company has erected no fewer than 40 dwellings for their employees. In addition, there are boarding houses, hotels, stores, butcher, and shoe shops. Altogether, Blairton is probably ahead of any other village of its age in Canada. Blairton's future looked bright indeed, but its destiny was fully dependent on the fortunes of the mine.
The mountain of iron ore was again hard rock mining, with all that entails, bringing in the workers, using the dynamite later on and earlier, using the gunpowder to loosen it, all that sort of effort. So this mining was, in those days, dangerous work. Dangerous work because they didn't have dynamite. Dynamite hadn't been invented. We were dealing with hand drilling and then gunpowder explosions. So when you try to take a mountain of iron ore down, there's a lot of manual labor in it, and then you plant the gunpowder, and then you light a fuse, which were notoriously uncontrollable. Some of them would go much faster than other fuses, and you knew one thing: after you lit it, you ran. And then if it didn't go off, you waited a long time before you went back to check it. And I was only able to find evidence of one fatality at the Marmora site related to this industry, but that may be a matter of record keeping. Either they were good runners or there were more than one fatality.
The construction, I can't imagine what it must have been like in 1850s to go north of Cobourg into the woods and build a railway in the summer with the thickness of the vegetation, the insects that were rampant, and men dressed not in shorts like we are, but in woolen shirts, long sleeve shirts and woolen pants and things of that nature, and God knows what kind of footwear.
The people that work this land, when I'm walking over it, you can imagine the difficulty of, getting the rock out of this part of the country, but just working this land alone. There's rock and trees, but the land itself is scarred. You can see where they've, dug pits here and there looking for, I'm sure, the iron ore. But the 3 pits that are on the property are very visible when you walk the land. And the one pit in the center of the property that I've retained on my 20-acre parcel, because I developed this land along with my good friend and neighbor, Bob Beattie. The 570 feet of shoreline that I think was used primarily for the mining operation. The pictures I've seen of the locomotive is just down the hill here in front of my house. And you can see with the writings that everything happened right here. So it's certainly a special piece of land. I've owned this land since 1986, and we have had such a good life here. The land has been nothing but a gift to our family. Being from the township, going back 5 generations, local history means something to me. This land I knew about, but I really didn't until I purchased it. And then it came to light. And the stories that's been shared with me over the years about this property and the special place it has in Canadian history, you can't measure it. One of the things I found so intriguing and enjoyable for me is when I walk the land, I get the stories. I think of those guys that actually did the work. I think, wow, the hard days that they had to put in. There's a lot of people here now. It's grown over my lifetime. Beautiful homes, and it's far from a ghost town.
With the demise in 1861 of the Cobourg and Peterborough railways and possibly long wooden bridge across Rice Lake, the loss of the link to Peterborough was a crippling blow to the railway, and within a few years it was forced to reorganize, bringing in new investors and with them a new name: the Cobourg, Peterborough, and Marmora Railway and Mining Company. This strung-out title aptly reflected the railway's new focus: mining and shipping iron ore from Blairton, all the way to the center of the booming steel industry in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
The story really starts with the demise of the Rice Lake Bridge in 1861, sometime in the winter, 1861, 1862. And there's a lot of subterfuge in there. It's come to light that one of the bondholders actually precipitated the collapse of the bridge by taking out the bolts because he'd invested in the Port Hope line and wanted the Cobourg and Peterborough line out of the way so that it wouldn't compete with his main money-making line, which was the Port Hope line. And anyway, and the bridge did fall apart completely, and it was never rebuilt. But there was a fellow in Cobourg who, in years previous, had been the one trying to get the bridge filled in as a causeway, which was the original plan. Fill in the whole 2.6 mile long bridge with dirt, make a causeway to make a permanent crossing across Rice Lake. And this fellow's name was John Dumble. And John was very upset, to say the least, when this bondholder took it upon himself to take the bolts out and let the bridge collapse, because Dumble had worked very hard in trying to get this causeway built. So Dumble then spent the next several years with James Cobourg, one of the fathers of Confederation from Cobourg. He and James Cobourg spent several years then trying to wrestle the remains of the railway away from this bondholder, who was Henry Covert, in order so that Cobourg could get its railway back. And the idea was to perhaps to rebuild the Rice Lake Bridge, or perhaps to try some other venture with the railway, but to try and do something with the railway, because this was Cobourg's, the town of Cobourg had made a huge investment in this. And so Dumble could not find any interest in rebuilding the Rice Lake Bridge, but he did find interest. He shopped the idea around down into the States, and it was after the Civil War was ending, and there was tremendous interest in getting some iron ore from Marmora down to Pittsburgh. And it was Dumble's idea to try and use the remaining track of the Cobourg and Peterborough Railway to get that ore to Pittsburgh. And really it was Dumble who put together the plan of how do you get the ore from Blairton, Marmora, whatever, that area down to Pittsburgh. And part of the plan then was to build cars that would be specifically designed to haul iron ore.
Mr. Dunn's research had determined that these ore cars probably were built by the Cobourg Car Works of Cobourg, which made some 150 of them for the Cobourg, Peterborough, and Marmora Railway and Mining Company of 1866. Some of the castings may have been made at the Helm Foundry in Port Hope, Ontario. but some of the wheel castings were made by the McDougall Company of Montreal. Pig iron for these castings most probably came from Les Forges de Saint-Maurice, north of Trois-Rivières, Quebec.
James Crossan, he came to Cobourg in the 1840s and became involved in an agricultural implement foundry, if you like, and they made a lot of like plows and whatever else implements were needed in those days. And then when the Cobourg and Peterborough Railway was resuscitated as the Cobourg, Peterborough and Marmora Railway, though the American owners contacted him to see if he would make ore cars, and he agreed to do that. Now those ore cars, interestingly enough, the foundry at that time was on a property where the Anglican Church is today, removed from the tracks. So the cars were made, moved through town, I guess on their own wheels, and then placed on the tracks in order to become functional, if you like.
The strategy was to exploit the reserves of the big ore bed located on the southwest shore of Crow Lake, the Blairton Mine, to Trent River Narrows. The freight charge from Blairton to Pittsburgh was estimated to be $4 per ton at the time, equivalent to about $75 a ton in today's currency.
They built from Trent Narrows to Blairton. That was a brand new railway. Then they had to figure out how are we getting the ore from Blairton Marmora to Cobourg. So they loaded the cars with ore in Blairton, transferred it by rail to Trent Narrows. They built a sort of a trestle over the water at Trent Narrows, and they would put barges underneath. The cars would go up on the trestle. They would dump onto the barge. The barge was then brought over to Harwood. A local person had invented a steam-operated elevator, so the elevator brought the ore from the barge up into another set of ore cars. They brought those ore cars down by the railway to the harbor in Cobourg, where they had built an elevated trestle all across the northern esplanade in the harbor. They would dump the ore there. Now, what I'm not certain of, I think they had a movable ramp of some kind where they could dump the ore and it would go directly into the holes of a ship, all done by gravity, or they would simply dump the ore on the ground, and then at some point in time it would be hand shoveled. And labor was cheap, so they didn't worry about things of that nature. So it was a convoluted manner of doing it. A lot of it went either to the mill. There was a steel mill or an iron smelting operation in Rochester, and some of it went down to Pittsburgh as well. So there were a couple of markets, if you like, for it. It was sporadic at the best of times, however.
Everything was in place by the spring of 1868, and production at Blairton Mine quickly ramped up to about 20,000 tons of iron ore per year by 1870. Much of the mining was done by hand, with ore being loaded into rail cars using planks and wheelbarrows. Mined rocks were selected individually, the idea being that those showing roughly 60% ore, or better, would be shipped. The others would be discarded, sometimes into the nearby lake.
It appears that Dumble was the one who came up with the design for the cars. And the cars appear to have been a descendant of a car, what they called a right-of-way car, used in the London and Birmingham Railway in 1838. We have an etching showing what we think is the predecessor of the iron ore cars used at Blairton. And so what Dumble did, though, being an engineer, it looks like it was, and this was his work, he beefed the whole thing up. Heavy oak timbers, so that it would haul about 3.5 tons of ore. And so it looks as though Dumble then takes these drawings to, and the whole idea at this time is to try and keep the costs down, because even though these fellows, the Schoenberger family, are the group in Pittsburgh who own the railway now, and even though they're one of the wealthiest families in the United States, still, costs are a concern. So Dumble takes this idea to James Crossan, who has a foundry in Cobourg. He's had no experience in building railway cars, but he does understand about making wrought iron. And there's another fellow in Cobourg, A.E. Munson. And Munson is Cobourg's premier carriage builder. So he knows about wood, wooden wagons and carriages. That's his specialty. So it's a joint effort between James Crossan and A.E. Munson. Munson's handling the wood, Crossan's handling the wrought iron. Now there's other pieces, and wrought iron is iron that's, you know, pounded into shape by hand, very labor intensive. And Crossan says, sure, I can make all these parts, latches and bolts and all these things. And Munson's quite happy to, you know, there's plenty of oak around, red oak, so he's happy to make that. But of course there's other sophisticated parts like wheels, bearings, journals, brakes, which have to be cast. And that is well beyond Crossan's capabilities. He's not doing any casting in this foundry in Cobourg. So those parts then are sourced from, we believe, from Montreal. The wheels that we found on the cars clearly stamped Montreal Car Wheel Works right on the wheel. So the wheels are cast in Montreal. The pig iron used, apparently it comes from Saint-Maurice. And then when they get to Cobourg, the cars all the pieces are brought together in the machine shop down by the harbor, and that's where they're assembled. The reports are that there were 150 of these cars made. The mine manager, John Lasky Onger, in his letters to the Marmora Herald says that generally speaking, the trains, the ore car trains, were 25 cars long. So, and he said that when things really got going in 1873, which was really the heyday of the mine, that was probably the peak year of production, 1873, there would be 3 trains a day from Blairton to the loading area at the Narrows. 3 train sets at the Blairton end on that 9-mile track, and then 3 sets on the Harwood-Cobourg track, which was 16 miles long. Anyway, they start building them, but something interesting happens as they're building the car, as they get the first cars into service. And they build the car, looks like to hold about 3.5 tons of ore. So it looks like they built the car originally to Dumble's specifications, but then they realized, wow, these cars are so strong, we could actually raise the sides of the box and get 5 tons in here. Of the 150, probably only a few are brake cars, in other words, have brakes attached to them, because the British model at that time, in the 1850s and 60s, was that the only cars on a train that would actually have brakes would be the very end car. And the rest of them would not have any brakes at all. And the linkages is just 3 links of chain. So there's a lot of jostling between the cars, and they have bumpers. Each car has sort of some form of bumper, 3 links of chain, so the cars are banging together a bit. So the British model was to keep the brakes on the last car lightly set. That would keep the train stretched out so there wouldn't be too much banging. Luckily for us, one of the cars that's hauled out of the Trent River is a brake car. So we do get the information as to how the brake cars were built, but probably they only built maybe a dozen out of the 150 that had brakes. So they're 2 different kinds of cars, brake cars and then regular cars. Another element of the story comes in, and that is by 1881, they have pretty well given up any hope of reactivating the mine. There's been a very deep depression in 1874, all through North America. Banks, steel mills, everything goes bankrupt. And that's when Blairton really ceases regular production, after the 1873 season. By 1874, the Depression sets in, virtually no ore is shipped after that point. So this 1881 operation is kind of a mopping up exercise. They've stored a lot of ore at the mine. They're bringing it out just to see, you know, let's just bring out what we've got. We'll see if we can sell it. So it could be that this is the very end of the operation, to the point where they can start unloading the brake cars, because we're not gonna, this is the end of it. This is really the end of the story. So there's a bit of speculation that it could have been because of that.
The Cobourg, Blairton, and Marmora Railway existed until 1893, and in 1893, the Grand Trunk Railway, which was in competition with the newly created Canadian Pacific Railway for lines in Ontario, they purchased the line. They didn't use it. They used it primarily for storage of their boxcars. At some point between, well, I'm not certain of the timing, sometime after 1893, the rail line, which had been, the Cobourg rail line had been built as a broad gauge railway, which means it was 5 foot 6 inches between the railheads. The Grand Trunk and most other North American railways were built to 4 foot 8.5 inch between the railheads, which is what it is today. So at some point in time after 1893, the Grand Trunk narrow gauged it, if you like, into the standard gauge. And they used it primarily to store boxcars and things of that nature on it. The occasional lumber operation took place as well, but there was an agreement that anything happened on the rail line the Grand Trunk wasn't responsible for. It was whoever was shipping the stuff out. There were 2 mills in Harwood in those days that shipped out lumber, and they used it for picnic excursions from Cobourg. There were quite a number of those. During the war, the actual steel, the rail, was lifted and sent to France and used over there. And so there's no rail in existence.
Tracks taken up and the trains gone. The prominence of the story about the ore cars accident at Trent River Narrows gradually receded. Details about what happened were still passed along by those who lived in the area, but no one was entirely sure what lay on the riverbed.
So there's a bunch of junk off the end of a dock. What's it worth, basically? And we made a presentation to Parks Canada in Peterborough here, the archaeology people, and Arthur and I, we put a slide presentation together, and they were kind of hesitant that we wanted to do this, but when they seen the slide presentation, they were wondering if had I done this before. And it was a team effort. There was 3 other guys, sport divers, that helped me. And it was a very good presentation, and they were impressed with it. So then the plan was to recover them.
So then applications were made to Parks Canada, and Arthur, being a retired federal civil servant, had great connections. He knew who to talk to. So he was able to get the minister to get behind it, get the works barge down there, and this would have been in 1980. They finally got the works barge down there. Now, ironically, Arthur was not there when the barge arrived to haul the cars up. He was working on another project in Europe at the time, and no one told him that this was the day that the barge was going to arrive. You can imagine, he'd been working on this for months. He was not told. The barge arrives with the crane on it to lift up the cars. Well, it was in October, and the water was quite muddy that day. And Brian McCrodin, the diver who had told Arthur about the cars, was there, and sort of to help out.
When we got there, the one diver from who I knew from Trent Severn Waterway here in Peterborough, Ozzie Bryan, He said, well, this is our job. I'm going to go in and dive. Great, good. They're right there. We had a drawing of them and everything. Well, he jumped in off the end of the wharf, and the water was murky in the fall. And he looked and swam all over and couldn't find them. And he said, well, I said, well, they're right there. They're right off the end of the dock. And he said, well, I can't find them. So then he said, you go in. So then that's how I ended up diving to do the hitch on them and rig them and get them out.
So that's how it went that day. It was Brian McCroden who actually hooked on the cables, and then during the course of that day, they hauled up 2 intact ore cars. I say intact. They were intact except for the very top part where the ore was in a box, and when they hit the water, that box must have been torn off. So the cars are there except for this ore box on top. So 2 cars come out, they're intact, and then there's bits and pieces from 2 more cars. And the remains of the last 2, they ran out of time that day, and so the remains of the last 2 cars were left there. So anyway, they had the cars, all these pieces on the Parks Canada barge. And there was great concern that these cars were made of red oak. Iron fittings, but mostly red oak. And there was great concern that once the oak had been exposed to air, that the wood would start to disintegrate. As it was, the wood was in remarkably good condition. There was no rot, but there was erosion from the current of the water, so that the wood had sort of been sculpted by 99 years of Trent River water flow, but no rot. Anyway, the concern was, well, now these cars are going to start to disintegrate, so we've got to protect them somehow. And nobody really knew how to do that. But they got the 2 intact cars to Peterborough, and they said, well, maybe we need to take steps to preserve the best one. So they picked the best of the 2 intact cars, took it up to a little creek between Peterborough and Lakefield, Sawyer's Creek, and resubmerged that car in the water as a means of preservation. And until they could figure out what was going to happen to these cars, where were they going to go, how were they going to display it. So they just, until we know all that, this car is just going to stay in the water. And it stayed there for the next, well, we don't know how long, but a year later, this would be October of 1981, they went back to check on the car, and I don't know how many times they checked on it in the interim, but a year later, they looked and it was gone. And to this day, nobody really knows what happened to that car, which was the best preserved car. It disappeared totally. And so now the second intact car is now at the museum in Ottawa. Some of the wheels to the car of these extra cars that were picked up, they're now at the National Historic Site in Saint Maurice, the forge. And because that's where the pig iron came from to make the wheels. So they're in Saint Maurice, and in Cobourg, we've accepted all the extra bits of wood and iron that were hauled up that day in 1980, and some of that has been used to create a full-size car. So some of the artifacts are in Cobourg, some are in Ottawa, some are in Saint Maurice, and that's the state of the items that were picked out of the water in 1980.
But despite having gone to the trouble of restoring so many of the iron parts, enthusiasm at Parks Canada for the idea of mounting a comprehensive exhibit telling the story of the ore cars waned. Ultimately, they chose to simply store the artifacts in their service centers for the past 33 years.
And we found that in a completely had no signs or anything on the outside of it. There was a storage center for the natural resources, I think it was, or it may have been another group. At any rate, a government building. So we went into this building, and with the permission of a lady who George had contacted ahead, and we said, we'd like to see this iron ore car. And she said, okay. And we went in the door, and lo and behold, there were probably about 500 bits of wood and bits of metal and stuff strewn all over the floors in the storage area. So we said, pretty good, but how do you put it together? And this lady said, well, we do have one that's somewhat together in this corner, but you can't have it because it's ours. We're not going to let you have that, but maybe we can do these other parts. So we looked at the original, and then we looked at the other. We recognized those big round things, they're wheels. There are a number of wheels over there. So that'll go together, this big long thing, and so on. Anyway, so we guessed we could put it together, and came to an arrangement that if we would take it away, they'd be quite happy to give all the bits and pieces to us, because they really didn't want them. They wanted to use the floor. So we arranged to have them shipped down to Cobourg.
And then we had to unwrap everything. Down at Cornwall, they had wrapped everything. Every nut and bolt was wrapped separately in bubble wrap and tape. And once we got it all unwrapped and laid out on a board, then came the part where we had to try and figure out how to put this thing together. We had some good-sized chunks of wood. We had the two main stringers and the two of the cross stringers. And so we set up a couple sawhorses, and we proceeded to put the old parts back together as much as we could. We got a pretty good indication of what the thing had looked like. So then George came in with drawings for, like he'd done the model and made drawings of it, and we nailed that up on the wall.
So anyway, we started to get these pieces of wood into the craft plant, and George, with George's help, he said, well, I think this piece would go in here, and so on, so we could cut saw them off the sides. We made the box to go on the top. We made the carriage for the wheels to be mounted on.
We got that part made up. We had a lot of parts made at the high school. The high school kids in the shop made, because the bolts in those days were all square-headed bolts and stuff. So we wanted to be as original as possible. So they made a lot of the bolts and the square nuts and stuff for us.
So we found out how they went. We found out that they had made a brass journal for the bearings on the top portion, just the top portion of the bearing. Of course, after all the weight is down on it, so you don't need a bottom portion. And we also found, with the bits and pieces we got from Cornwall, one of those bearings was in there, and the bearing had been worn such that it had a very sharp edge to the one edge, almost a cutting edge. And what had happened, the bearings were lubricated supposedly by the people who were shipping the ore, of course, the train business and so on, and they were used by stuffing a rag close to the bearing and pouring some oil on it. And we think the bearing actually, when it didn't get oiled, in other words, one of the ones that was missed Friday afternoon job, if you know what I mean, and we think that actually the bearing jammed, and that's probably what gave the train driver the problem of moving these ore cars along. We think that actually, in fact, it jammed, and we think that what happened was it jammed, and he put the extra steam on, and all of a sudden the whole thing broke free, and the cars went into the river.
And dump them, and we're not exactly sure how they were dumped, but the box is so well balanced on it. Like when you look at the car, it's offset. It's heavier on one side than the other. But when we got it all together, it was so well balanced that I just took my thumb and just pushed the box up when it was sitting there. Like there was just no effort at all to put it up. So we figured they probably loaded the car a little bit heavier on the side that opened, and then they would have a couple of poles, levers that they could put underneath the box and flip it up. But I think if they loaded it just half a dozen pounds heavier on one side, they'd just pull the pin and it would almost dump itself.
We put the ore car together with different things. We had our problems, knowing how things worked and so on. I must admit that the help given by the other guys, I think, was tremendous. They brought in their own tools, they brought their time and their ideas, and they took problems home with them and resolved them and so on. They did a magnificent job. It was a real team job. It was very, very good. We had a pad put down with rails on it and supports and railing around the outside, and the union people did all that. It was terrific, all for free, you know. And the kids, they weren't kids, they're 20-year-olds and so on, who were getting their training, they really enjoyed it, you know, and we enjoyed it with them. We had pictures and put it, actually on the back of our brochure, we have a picture of the union boys there doing an excellent job.
Oh, there is an interesting aspect, there's one other interesting aspect to this story. It has a Trent Severn waterway tie-in. And that is, when they finally got the operation working in 1867, they got the barges loaded at the Narrows, and they were bringing them up through Hastings. The lock at Hastings had been built by Hughes Baird in 1840, but it had never been used till that point, and it had fallen into disrepair. So it needed some repairs so that they could get the barges in there. And typically the barges were lashed to the side of a steamboat at the Narrows, and maybe one on each side and maybe one towed. Typically 3 barges for this steamboat would get them from the Narrows through Hastings up to Harwood. Anyway, they got to Hastings, and just upstream from the lock, the water level was too shallow, and the barges were running aground. These barges were loaded with iron ore. And so Dumble said, he went to the people running, in charge of that lock, and he said, well, guys, we've got an operation here now. There's a commercial operation. We need to get more water now. And he went back to look at Cobaird's notes about how that Hastings lock was supposed to work. And Baird's he was an engineer, and he stipulated that in order for the system to work, the dam at Hastings had to back up 3 feet of water above existing levels in order to make the upper Trent between Hastings and Rice Lake navigable. Dumble could see that this was not being done. The stop logs had not been put in place. So he went and said, well, guys, this dam was built for the specific purpose of making this navigable. You haven't put the stop logs in place. And so he asked for them to be put in place to raise the level upstream of the dam so barges could get through. Well, he encountered significant resistance in trying to get that order through, because if that was done, a lot of people upstream from the dam had private waterworks, little mills and things. If you backed up 3 feet of water, all of their investments out the window, because there's no flow. It's dead water all the way into Rice Lake. So even though Baird had built the dam and the lock for this specific purpose of backing up the water to make this navigable, Dumble could not get the permission to put the stop logs in, to put it into operation, because it was too politically sensitive. The other people who didn't want it backed up were the lumbermen, because they were floating rafts of squared timber down through Rice Lake, through Hastings. There was a timber slide at Hastings. They didn't want the water backed up because that would stop the flow, and they would have a much harder time in getting all their squared timber rafts down. So the bottom line was, the only people who wanted the water backed up was Dumble and the railway. Everyone else said, no, just leave it the way it is. Let this thing flow, because, and the railway did not have enough clout to ever get those stop logs put in. They never got put in because there was too much political opposition. It wasn't until 1920, when the rest of the system had all been built, finally, the dam at Hastings, the stop logs were put in, and finally, then the 3 feet of water are backed up. And so what ends up happening then is that this is when people in Rice Lake talk about them raising the water level. Well, they didn't actually raise the water level in Rice Lake. What they did is, instead of it being allowed to fall from the spring high water level down 6.5 feet to low water level in October, using the dam at Hastings, it was kept permanently at its spring high water mark, and that's the way it is today. But in the life of this railway, Dumble could never get that actually done, and for that reason, the operation, this whole operation, could only function during times of high water. Spring, early summer, and then the whole thing had to shut down. So they were lucky to get 4 months out of this because of the fact they could never get that dam put into operation.
When the mine closed permanently in 1874, the population dropped dramatically to less than 50 in the first 6 months. The Klasky store was the last building to survive, but by the turn of the century, no structure was left standing. The mine easily escapes notice of passing motorists because of a few acres of brush that blocked the view. Eventually, the open mine pit filled with water and the furnaces across the lake on the Crow River lay in ruins.
So this is one of the last few places where people can come by and see a little bit of history, and you're commuting on the Trent Severn Canal at the same time. So everyone who comes between Lake Ontario and Lake Simcoe and Georgian Bay has an opportunity to drive by this little bit of history. Well, as a steward of the property, I just enjoy being part of history, you know, having a place. The inside of my house I've decorated with a railroad field before because of it, and yeah, it ties you to what's been here.
The name Blairton still carries a certain nostalgia, for Blairton is written into the pages of history. The history of a community contributes to its personality. Preserving the history of a place through its significant historic resources gives a community its unique character. Historic preservation provides a link to the roots of the community and its people. Overall, it adds to the quality of life, making for a more livable community, and involves much more than simply saving and restoring old buildings and sites of historic importance. There are economic, cultural, environmental, and educational benefits of preservation, all of which are inextricably connected to one another and to the living memory of involved communities.
I just can't imagine the fortitude of those men. I mean, they must have been incredibly durable.
I would say in recognition of the people that did it back in the early 1800s.
Well, it's always important to remember your heritage, to remember the past, because, well, perhaps not in this case, but in a lot of cases, you remember the past so that you don't make the same mistakes in the future.
I think there was a challenge, the challenge that the Canadians could actually build this little thing, which wasn't very important. It's just a few bits of wood and some iron. It was done by a little town called Cobourg. I mean, I think that, for me, I think that I hate to see that history lost. I'd like to perpetuate in some way. We've perpetuated in the ore car, which is now located by the marina. I think that kind of camaraderie, putting this model, if you like, together and preserving a little bit of history, to me was, I found it so challenging and so rewarding.
Historic preservation helps keep communities beautiful, vibrant, and livable, and gives people a stake in their surroundings. It connects people with their past and with one another. History is a great educator, and coming to know the history of a community and its historical sites fosters an individual sense of belonging and community pride.
I fell in love in '65. Margaret Bowen was her name. My family moved above the border. Alice is my family name. We built our home by the riverside, little north of the big ore bed. We watched the town of Blairton prosper. Good place to live, so the papers said. Paying wage was hard to find. The big ore bed men could mine. Though Charlie Hayes had tried and failed, a new plan, build some rail. 400 men on a mountainside. The train was called the Pioneer. Foreman Onger in control. 2-mile run, Trent River pier. Times were hard, but life was good. At Caskey's store, our credit stood. The mine had paid $1 a day, shipping ore to the USA. The big ore bed on Squirrel Lake shore kept the wolves from the door, brought my neighbors to this land, and to this day their names still stand. Van Sickle, Cole, Van Valkenburg, Sophus, Steenberg, Anderson, Yeoman's Purdy, Rogers, DeShay, Burgess, Pierce, Matheson, Murphy Lake, Van Norman Scott, McMillan, Kelch, Hamilton, Clemenger, Wild, Barons, Chard, Jones, Johnson, Levere, Gratton, Houghton, Aldhouse, Buchanan, Hay, Wellman, Pounder, Fehrenbach, Russell, Blair, McGowan, Young, McGill, Bentley, Bannon, Mac. I fell in love in '65. Margaret Bowen was her name. I came from down below the border. Alice is my family name.